Hey there, I'm Rachel Ehring, and you're listening to the Top Music Piano Podcast. Get inspired as we discuss creative resources, trends in piano pedagogy, ways to grow your income and streamline your studio, and new ways to engage your students each week. If you are a teacher who wants to go beyond the method books to create an innovative studio that fosters lifelong music makers, you've come to the right place. Hello, piano teachers. Thank you so much for joining me today for this episode of the podcast. We're doing a series this month about multi-teacher studios, and I was lying in bed the other night thinking about who I should have come on the podcast, and I thought, well, I guess I run a multi-teacher studio. Maybe there's something that I could share about. So I'm going to share with you something that is at the forefront of my mind right now, and that is hiring teachers. Let me give you a little bit of background. So I don't own my own music studio. I was hired by a church in 2022 to run their music conservatory, which essentially is a community music school, but it's not one that I myself own. At that time, the conservatory had been closed for about 2 years because of the pandemic, and I was hired to get it reopened and running again. So I had to start completely from scratch. There were no teachers, no students, only a space for us to use, but everything else was pretty much non-existent. Maybe someday I'll do an episode about all the things that I did those first few months to get things up and running. But I don't want to get too in the weeds on this episode since today we're talking about hiring teachers. But I wanted you to have a little bit of background about the situation that I'm in, since it's different than many of you who are running independent studios. Another thing you might want to know is that the church has an HR department who takes care of all the logistics of onboarding new teachers. So I'm not going to get into the specifics of that part of things. I will tell you this, that all of our teachers are employees rather than independent contractors. And here in California, I think that's the better option. But I know that it varies from state to state and country to country as well. But back to 2022. I had to hire a team of teachers in order to get students in the door, which was a little tricky because I wasn't sure how many teachers to hire because I wasn't sure how many students we would have. But I ended up hiring around 12 teachers, I think, at that point. And now I have a team of about 14 or 15 teachers. Right now I'm actually going through a pretty big transition time with my staff, which is why I say 14 or 15 because it's currently fluctuating a little. This is also why this topic is on my mind right now. It just happened the past couple of months that several of my teachers had babies and went on maternity leave. One got a full-time position at another school. One left to spend more time with her family. And so I'm left trying to piece my staff back together and work out all the pieces of the puzzle to accommodate everyone and everyone's schedules. So through this process, I've learned a lot. And I thought that maybe some of these things that I've learned and that I've been thinking about recently would be helpful to you, especially if you're thinking of hiring a teacher, or maybe you can take something from this episode if you're hiring again in the future. So let's get into it. And I'm going to tell you the things I've learned from hiring, I would say, over 20 teachers over the past couple of years. The first thing that I've learned is that it is always better to meet the candidate in person. Maybe this seems obvious, but there are times when it is so much more convenient to do a phone interview. Zoom is better than a phone call because at least you can see the person, but I always ask the potential teacher to come in to meet me at the conservatory if possible. And there's a few reasons for this besides the obvious ones. One is that I just get a much better sense of a person meeting them in real life. But there are some other reasons too. I want them to make the commitment of driving to the location where they'll be working. I want them to actually get in their car and see how far it is and what traffic is like, and also to see the space where they would be teaching. Wouldn't that be awful if I hired someone and then on the first day they showed up and said, oh, I didn't realize how far this was, and I don't think I can commit to making the drive. That would be a nightmare. I also make a mental note of if they show up on time or even a little early. How they present themselves as far as how they dress and carry themselves isn't necessarily going to make or break it for me, But I do notice if the person looks like they just rolled out of bed or if they put a little effort in to look put together. I recently did a phone interview with a potential candidate because she was out of town over the holidays, and so we weren't able to meet in person at that time. And I just couldn't get a good sense for what she was like. I ended up asking if she could come in for an in-person interview a couple weeks later. And I'm so glad I did because I actually liked her so much better in person than over the phone. It was the strangest thing. So that's the first thing that I've learned is, if possible, always meet the potential teacher in person. All right, the second thing I've learned is that not every interview is going to be the same. Because I've done a lot of interviews, I don't use really a script anymore. When I first started out, I had a list of questions to keep me on track. And I know that some people want to ask the exact same questions to every candidate, and I think there is a good case for asking everyone the same questions. But personally, I tend to treat it more like a podcast interview, honestly, where I'm just trying to get to know them and find out about their teaching style and just what they're like, what their personality is like. I do always start with the same question, which is similar to a podcast interview. Tell me a little about yourself. It's very open-ended, and sometimes it actually throws people off because they're not expecting that. But I like to see where they go with it. Sometimes they'll tell me, about how they started taking music lessons when they were 4 years old, or sometimes they'll tell me about their family or their education. It's just really interesting to see how they answer that question. From there, I usually ask about their teaching experience and education, and then I almost always ask how they like to start beginner students. In our particular situation, we have a lot of beginner students, so it's important, but this also gives me a really good idea of their teaching style. So I ask about if they have a favorite method book or what they like to do in those early lessons. You might be surprised that I've had teachers give me all kinds of answers, although I've actually had very few, if any, teachers give the kind of answers that I suspect you all would give, which would be about creativity and improvisation and audiation, all the things that we talk about on this podcast. Almost all the teachers are familiar with Faber and Alfred, and those are what they typically have used with their students. But it's always interesting for me to get a sense if they are familiar with method books, if they've thought about ideas that are outside of the box for teaching young students, if they maybe don't use a method book for beginning lessons. So I get a really good sense of their approach and their pedagogical background by asking that question. Those are some of my standard questions. And then the rest of the interview, I tend to tailor toward the specific person. And then near the end, I always ask about their availability and how many days or hours they're hoping to teach. And I make sure I take notes during that part because I always think I'm going to remember, and then I don't. And their schedule is a huge factor in who I end up hiring. I could interview a rock star piano teacher who I absolutely adore, but if he or she's only available one afternoon a week and it's not the afternoon that I need, then it's just not going to work out. The third thing that I've learned in hiring piano teachers is not to ignore potential red flags. Again, this might seem obvious, but sometimes people will say pretty amazing things in their interview, and I have learned to pay attention to those things. It's always interesting to me how they'll talk about their previous employers. I've had candidates who have said very unflattering things about more than one of their previous employers, which makes me wonder why they couldn't get along with any of their bosses. And to me, that's a red flag, or at least maybe a pink one that makes me pause and consider what is going on and if they're going to be able to get along in a collaborative environment. Showing up late is another red flag for me, although if they at least acknowledge it and apologize or maybe give me a call to let me know they're running late, I will let it slide one time, but I do make a mental note of it. I had one guy show up an hour and 20 minutes late for his interview and not even say anything about it. I told my colleague, if it was an hour, I could at least assume he'd gotten the wrong time. But an hour and 20 minutes is so random. You can't even assume it was a mistake. So needless to say, I did not hire that person. The fourth thing I've learned in hiring teachers is to ask for references and then call the references. Now, if you're an independent teacher making your first hires, this might seem like an annoying hoop to jump through. And I completely understand. I hate making phone calls, honestly. But typically, people put down references that they know are going to say glowing things about them. So we wonder why even bother calling the references, right? But I've found that it is really affirming to hear someone else talk about the potential candidate. At my job, we're actually required to reference check for each hire, so I don't have a choice, and we're given a list of questions to ask. But I encourage you to do this step, even if it isn't required. Yes, the references will typically say very nice things about the candidate and show them in a glowing light, but it will still give you a clearer picture of how they work with others. One of the questions on the list that we ask is, what are the candidate's strengths and potential growth areas? Which is a really nice way of asking about the person's weaknesses, right? And it's really enlightening to hear what the person giving the reference has to say about this and how they answer that question. Not to mention that I've gotten to chat with some really nice people on the phone, usually fellow musicians, often in my area. And so it's nice to make those connections as well when I'm calling to check references. The fifth thing I've learned from hiring teachers, and possibly the most important thing, is to trust my gut. Now, I know that none of us want to come across as judgmental, so it can feel petty to not hire someone because they were late to the interview or because of what they wore. But we have to remember that we have a responsibility to the students and also to the parents of our students. And these teachers are going to be an extension of us and our brand. So choosing carefully and wisely will make you and your studio family so much happier in the long run. And I actually have another tip that goes along with this, and that is not to hire out of a place of desperation. I have definitely been guilty of this on more than one occasion, and it usually doesn't turn out very well. I might need a teacher to start immediately, and I only have one candidate that seems like even a possibility, so I hire that person and just hope for the best, even though my gut might have been telling me it wasn't going to be the best fit. It is such a hard position to be in, to feel desperate for a teacher and not have any ideal candidates. You might have to put students on a wait list temporarily or even refund a few weeks of tuition while you are getting the right person in place. I have found that families typically are very understanding because they want the best teacher for their child. They don't want you hiring someone out of desperation either. So again, trust your gut. I think the one thing to be careful of with this, however, is that it is okay to hire someone different from yourself. I heard someone say once that we all have the tendency to hire people like ourselves, when often we should be hiring people who are different from us. If you listened to the podcast last week, Shannon and I talked about hiring teachers that have the same vision as you and fit into your brand. So I'm not talking about that, but hiring someone who can add some diversity to your staff can be a really positive thing. And I know we all have ideas that pop into our head when we think diversity, but it could be any number of things. Maybe they're in a different age bracket than you, or maybe they have a background in jazz when you have a background in classical. Don't be afraid to hire someone who has different strengths than you and then help them play to those strengths. But that being said, if your gut is telling you that something is off, you should trust yourself. And if you aren't sure, there are ways that you can explore things further even after that initial interview. You could potentially have the candidate teach a mock lesson or a trial lesson. If you have anyone else working in your business with you, you could ask the candidate to come in for a second interview where you have someone else from your team join you for the interview just to get another opinion. But nobody knows your business the way you do. So at the end of the day, use your instincts to make the best choice for your business. So to recap here at the end, the things that I've learned in hiring over 20 music teachers are: number one, always meet the candidate in person. Number 2, not every interview is going to be exactly the same, and that's okay. You can go with the flow based on an outline of questions that you've prepared. Number 3, don't ignore potential red flags. Number 4, do check references. And number 5, trust your gut. I would love to hear from you if this episode was helpful or if you have things that perhaps you've learned in hiring teachers. You can find me on Instagram at Rachel Ehring. And in case you haven't heard, Top Music has a brand new podcast for the new year called the Top Music AI Podcast, hosted by Tara Wright. And it is really fascinating, all about using AI in the studio and how it can help save you time and help you be even more creative. In fact, I'm thinking you could actually use AI for some of the things that I talked about today, like coming up with great questions to ask potential teachers. So check out the Top Music AI podcast to learn from Tara and her AI co-hosts. Thank you so much for joining me today. I feel so honored that you chose to listen to this show, and I don't take that lightly ever. I'm Rachel Ehring, and this is the Top Music Piano Podcast. I will talk with you again next week.
How do you keep up to date with all the latest trends and research into music education? How do you connect with other teachers around the world and make sure your teaching stays fresh and relevant for students of all ages and stages, both now and into the future? I created our Top Music Pro membership to be the one-stop shop for music teaching resources, training, support, and community, and I'd love for you to come and join us inside. With over 40 comprehensive training courses, hundreds of teaching demonstrations and lesson plans, free monthly sheet music, discounts, and all the business and pedagogy support you could ever need, Top Music Pro is the community you've been looking for. If you're ready to level up your learning from the podcast and join thousands of other teachers in our global network, head over to topmusicpro.com today.